Hey guys, I wanted to talk to y'all today about bubbles in your dice. So bubbles are in any die that are plastic molded injected. They're opaque or clear as long as they're plastic molded injected. As we've seen in the other videos, we don't think that the Chesic opaque dice are made through plastic mold injection until they show me otherwise. I think they're not. They wouldn't have these types of bubbles in them. So these dice, first of all, were donated from Louis Zacci from Game Science. He wanted me to talk about these bubbles. So what are these bubbles? They're actually not bubbles, they're pockets of vacuum. And if you know anything about glass, there's a thing called a St. Rupert's drop. They melt glass and they drop it into cold water, and it causes the outside of the glass to form first very rapidly and harden really quickly, and the inside of the glass is still cooling very slowly. And because when something hot cools down, it contracts, so it starts pulling against the walls of the outer side of the drop. And what happens is it pulls open these little small pockets, and these pockets are a vacuum. There's no air in them whatsoever. So that's how glass does that. Well, how does that do that in your die? Well, in the mornings when they turn on the machine to start doing plastic mold injection, the molds are cold. So they shoot this plastic at 2,000 psi into the mold. That's pounds per square inch. And the plastic outside of it, since the mold's cold, cooled down first. And then the inside cools down a lot slower, which then in turn the bubbles start to form because it pulls against the walls of the it's pulling, contracting because of the cold, and rips open these little bitty bubbles of vacuum. Now, what does that do to the die? Well, first of all, these dies are going to have less of a any die when it first comes out of the mold will contract down 0.2%. These will have less than 0.2% because they harden so quickly in the mold. Also, on St. Rupert's drop, this causes the drop to be as hard as steel. You could take a St. Rupert's drop and hit it with a ball peen hammer, and it will not shatter. You had to snip the tail off the end of the drop, and I'll attach a video about St. Rupert's drops to this as well. Now, I'm going to set this die aside first. I'm going to talk about these guys here. If you notice that the bubble on these are closer to the center, a little bit offset, and what I did was I mixed up some of my solution, which is Epsom salts and water, and I put these dice into the solution and rolled them a couple hundred times in the solution and wrote down the numbers and did the percentages, and I received on these a variation of about 4 to 6% for each side, which to me, for just a couple hundred rolls, that to me is perfect. I would play with these in game. They would be completely random enough for me to play. Now, this die here, if you notice under the 8, we have a bubble right under the 8, less than a millimeter from the surface. So I decided to do this one. I did this one about 1,000 times to get a better number. But what happened was it pulled 8 the most. Out of that, 18, 16, and 6. It pulled those sides, all these sides, about 15 to 20% of the time. So the other sides didn't pull as much. And the reason for this, even though there's no air there, that section, this side, is missing more mass than this side is. That makes this side heavier in water. The variations of this will cause, in the water test, this side to come up all the time. Now, the water test is really sensitive for mass. So I decided to also roll this in a dice tower 500 additional times and write down the numbers on them and do the percentages on that. And when I did, this die, each side came up around 4 to 6% of each time. So that, to me, on a tabletop or in a dice tower, I would still play with this dice here, because the amount of plastic missing is like maybe a grain. I speak in reloading terms, so a grain is less than a gram. So this die is still a good die, but on tabletop. I don't expect a lot of people to be playing in saltwater, so they wouldn't be playing D&D in saltwater or whatever RPG you play. But this is still a good rolling die. So in conclusion, unless it's missing a ton of plastic because of a small vacuum pocket, the die will still roll good on a tabletop or in a dice tower. They are still good dice to play with. So if you find a die, put it to the float test. See how it turns out. If it's closer to the center, you're going to get a truer roll. But even if it's closer to the edge, it still should not matter. Questions and comments below, and I'll also insert the link for the St. Rupert's drop. Or Prince Rupert's drop. Sorry, I've called it Saint throughout this entire video. It's Prince Rupert's drop.